All right, guys, I finally did it. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So, as you saw from that intro, I kind of took my word back and I bought myself a BLI E6. Now, regular fans of the channel will know that I made a video previously. It's basically saying I'm not going to buy one of these and give my reasons why. And those reasons basically came down to one, the BLI engine is way too expensive with an MSRP of $600. And two, this engine has already been produced a lot from many brass manufacturers for cheaper and for just as good, if not better, detail. And for BLI to produce an engine that's already relatively available in mass in the brass market, and also the cheaper market with the MDC Roundhouse and Bowser kits, with an engine that's already been produced in such large quantities in HO, relatively speaking, not ready to run, but just in general, for them to make an engine like that, and also charge so much, there's just no reason. I would wish they made a different engine that was less readily available in the brass market, for example, for cheap. So those are my main things, because brass engines, like for example this gem engine here, I paid $90 for this guy. The gem ones look pretty decent, and that's the reason why I felt like there's no reason for them to buy a BLI engine, because you could just get a brass one for like $90, maybe $100, add a decoder in there, paint it yourself, and you'd be basically up, down $200 instead of $600 here. And so that's the main reasons why I didn't want people to, or I personally didn't want to buy one of these. But circumstances have changed, and so after some further research, I've realized that actually the two main brass manufacturers I mentioned in the previous video, which was Alco Brass here and Gem Brass here. Why is this not cooperating? Actually do have some limitations in their detail and their accuracy. So that's one point negated. And also, BLI have been selling these in the refurbished sites, outlet stores, for only $300. And that's including DCC sound, which I don't really like their Paragon 4 sound, but I gotta admit, it is sound, it is DCC, and it also has Keep Alive or Stay Alive. And honestly, for $300, that is far more reasonable for a ready-to-run engine with a die-cast construction, with good paint, questionable sound, but a reliable engine, all around, that doesn't require a significant amount of work. So those are my main gripes with this engine previously, and those circumstances have changed. So now I take back my word. If you can find one of these for $300 or less, I think it is a good buy. And I'll explain why in a little bit, with a long list of pros and cons of my opinion on this engine, basically divided in pros and cons. And yeah, so without further ado, let's get started. All right, so let's get started with the pros of this engine. As I said, this is a revolutionary product from BLI. They've included a lot more, newer technologies, I guess you could call it, new features that you don't see in older style engines. And so I figured I would share all the things that they've done right, I think. So first things first, it's extremely impressive that they added a Keep Alive, a sound decoder, and speakers inside this tiny little tender. I mean, granted, this tender has, the cola doesn't go all the way down, and so it's only up here, but they still have just this little tiny space down here to fit all that stuff in. It's definitely possible to do it by yourself. I fit a Keep Alive speaker and decoders into a tiny little 040 slope back tender, a Rivarossi 040, but it's still impressive from a factory engine to do this. I think it's a really good thing, and I'm sure many people would have a hard time fitting that in like BLI did. So it's quite impressive. Next up, I thought that the cap kerns. Cap kerns is something you usually don't see in brass engines or ready-to-run engines. The only one I know that people have done is the Proto 2000 engines, which usually come with optional cap kerns you could add. Cap kerns are very common in real-life engines, but again, it's not something you usually see on models because it's just not a detail that people usually actively look for. But BLI did decide to include them, and they also painted them, which looks really nice. I really like that detail. I also like the pipes here near the steam delivery. This is something very particular to the Pennsylvania Railroad. This tiny little detail here, this is usually only seen in really high-end brass, like engines that cost $500, $700, $1,000. You don't see them in cheaper brass, older brass or ready-to-run engines, but BLI have included that, which is a very nice little touch. It is on both sides. I'm not 100% sure what they do, but they do connect to the steam delivery pipes from the boiler. Another thing is the headlight conduit. I thought that, this headlight conduit right here basically these the grab irons or the handrails that go along the sides of the engine also double as electrical conduits. So, inside this, in real life, they would have, electrical power going through them. And so these boxes, these junction boxes, where they split. And so traditionally speaking, the generator would generate power. It would go to this head like this, it goes to this conduit, which would then, run through the rest of the engine. And actually that's how that goes into the cab right there. But this box is usually missing on a lot of ready-to-run engines, and only very few of them I've seen have it. And so that's a really nice detail that BLI added. I actually have to add it on some other brass engines which are missing, so it's a nice touch. Another thing is the flexible plastic details. So all these details are all, molded in either metal, or this metal wire like this, or they're molded in this like really flexible plastic, which I think is a really good touch because you don't want this stuff to be damaged. And I feel like this would break really easily if it were brittle, but it is molded in a very soft plastic, which is a really good touch. Another thing is the tender shovel details. So I don't know if you can see it, but on the tender, right there, let me see if I can focus this better. You can see a tiny little shovel and a little, I believe this is a brake lever. I'm not really sure though, but some other details here. These are usually missing on, most ready-to-run and even brass engines, and the fact that BLI included that is very impressive. So I think it's a nice touch. Also, the number boards are mounted at 3 points in these engines. So traditionally speaking, I thought this was actually an inaccuracy, but turns out this is actually real. I'm learning something new every day, But these number plates in the front, at least, I don't know about other engines, but at least for Pennsylvania Railroad, their Keystone number plates were mounted with three like screw holes basically. So, in real life, as I said, these would have 3 holes for screws in the back, and then you'd mount it through that. It would not be one single, mounting point. And then that's a really nice subtle feature that I think BLI did a really good job on. You could see that it looks far more prototypical, and that's something that even brass engines have, mistaken. I don't think any, or if you buy a Keystone number plate from any brass manufacturer like Kale Scale or Precision Scale, it'll only come with a single, mounting, pin of sorts. So that's a really nice touch. Also the builder's plate. Oh, by the way, the paint job is fantastic. I mean, the gold leaf lettering on the engine and tender, and the builder's plate, that looks really nice. It is printed on. It's not a separate brass piece, but it does look really nice, and it's very noticeable. As well as the the tender rear here. That's also a very, very nice touch. The builder's plate here. Again, it is printed on. It's not a separate piece, but it looks nice. And lastly, and I think honestly, most importantly, there's one thing that I think BLI did an extra good job on, and that is, if I go down low here, hopefully you guys can see that. Unlike a lot of other of their ready-to-run offerings, such as their Hudsons, for example, which I've actually made a video about a few days ago, the tolerances between the trucks and the frame is a lot finer here. You can actually barely see any, visible gaps between the trailing truck and the frame. That's a very nice touch. It looks far more realistic instead of having a huge, gap, which looks almost toy-like. But this actually looks really good, and yet there still is ample space for this truck to move, as well as the leading truck here. You can see again, there's barely any space, and that's a really nice touch. It looks far more complete. It doesn't look like like a toy, and also more importantly, it still functions properly. There's ample space for this truck to move, and this engine also benefits because it's such a small engine. You don't need such large tolerances. If you're like making a big boy that has to run on 18-inch curves, then you're gonna have to add more tolerance. But this engine's already really small, and it's supposed to run on, I believe, 18-inch radius, and so this is already, they can basically make it less. They can also they can make it more realistic, and that's a really nice touch. I'm glad BLI chose to take advantage of that and make it look a lot nicer. So that's all the pros of this engine. I think Broadway Limited did a lot of good details that, again, most other manufacturers and or even brass would miss. They also just did a good job with the the frame and the overall tooling with this engine. So yeah. All right, and now for some things I think BLI could have done better on in the E6 model. I'm going to use this older Paragon 2 I1SA as a reference, so that's why it's in the background. But anyways, there's a few things that I think BLI could have done better that are, they're minor nitpicks. They're not super big, but I figured I'd still share them. So let's go. So first things first is the safety valves. These things are actually painted gold. They're not actually brass, not bare brass at least. I don't know if you could tell on camera, but in person it's very obvious how these are not, or these are painted, and that's real brass right there. And the bezels are real brass. With these mounted so closely, it's very obvious, at least to the naked eye, that these are not the same. They're not brass. That's a very minor nitpick, but it's probably BLI trying to be cheap and save a little bit of cost. So yeah. Another thing they try to save cost on is the number plate here. This is actually not an etched brass piece. This is a painted on 2D piece. And if you actually compare these with the PCM or the Paragon 2 I1SA, these are actually brass. And these older style engines, they used to actually use etched number plates on these engines. You can feel the texture. They're actually, 3D, and they actually look much better in my opinion. These also had etched builder's plates as well, which that guy's missing as well, but we won't talk about that. Again, probably another cost-cutting feature. Etched brass obviously costs a little bit more, but I can understand. Another thing is the oversized marker lights. Now, this is kind of a sacrifice. This is a pro and a con. In order to make the headlights or marker lights be functional, they made them really, really large. They look like potatoes. I call them potato headlights or marker lights because they just look so huge. They're way oversized, way chunky, and they don't actually look like the clawfoot marker lights, which Pennsylvania were iconic for. Pennsylvania markers or clawfoot markers look like this. They had those 4 feet on each side, and they're not huge. And these are just not only oversized, but they don't have any of the details. It just looks like a cylinder with 4 lenses on the sides. So doesn't look great. But again, that's a sacrifice they made to make them functional. They probably could have made them smaller and somehow found some other way to make them light up, but I won't talk about it. Again, it's a sacrifice. It's a pro and a con. So yeah. Another negative is the drawbar design. So this is also more of a pro and a con kind of idea. So this style of drawbar is the kind that articulates, which expands when the engine's on curves and contracts when the engine is straight. This means that the engine and tender coupling distance can be rather short when it's on straight track, but when it's on the sides, it can expand to allow tighter radius curves. This is a nice design, but it does come with 2 drawbacks. For one, it's plastic. Both of these pieces are plastic, which means if the engine is somehow, handled poorly, maybe, I don't know. Basically, it could be broken, unlike a metal drawbar, which is usually standard. It's more fragile, and also you got to remember that anything that's attached to the rear of this tender, like a long train, for example, is being puts pressure on this drawbar. So there's a greater chance of this thing breaking. Plastic, as it ages, could also potentially become brittle. So again, there's some problems with that, but we won't talk about that. Another thing is, because it's this design, there's no way to adjust the distance. So, on a normal metal drawbar, you have multiple holes, which you can couple the tender to adjust the distance between the cab and the tender. In this case, there's no way to adjust that. It's just this constant distance, which you cannot change. So, yeah. Again, pros and cons, but I personally don't take issue with it. I think it's a cool design, although I wish it was made out of metal. All right, 2 other detail parts, which are detail issues, which I think are personally more bothersome, at least to me, is the running boards. For one, these running boards are very chunky. Now, in the photos, I originally thought that the reason why they were so chunky is because they were die-cast, along with the boiler. This engine has a die-cast boiler. It's a plastic cab, die-cast tender frame. I figured these were die-cast as well. That's why they're so thick, because, you can't really make really fine die-cast. Like, the reason why these tender walls are kind of thick is because it's die-cast. And this doesn't look that bad. There's definitely far more offensive die-cast engines which have really, really thick, tender walls and stuff. And this, I thought, was the same reason. Thought this was the same case. This was die-cast, and therefore that's why it's so thick. But no, this is actually plastic, which is really strange because there's plenty of plastic running boards that are much thinner. Proto 2000 engines have really finely detailed running boards, which are plastic and very thin. They look really nice. BLI themselves have even made models that have, much thinner running boards that are plastic that look better, like including this PCM one. Yes, it's maybe not the thinnest as possible, but it's much, much thinner than the E6, which really stands out. If you look at this engine from any angle, it's a clear giveaway that it's a BLI engine because of those really thick running boards. But yeah, I don't see why they couldn't have made them thinner. They did it in the past before. I don't know why they made them thick this time. I suspect it's maybe because when lifting up this engine, which is, you know, not super duper light. People usually lift it from the running boards and they didn't want it to break. But honestly, I don't really see it breaking. I mean, the engine's not that heavy. There's a smoke unit to this boiler, and the motor takes up the rest of the space, so it's actually not that heavy. There's not much weight inside the actual boiler. The boiler itself is die cast, and that makes up for most of the weight. But inside the boiler is just this where usually there's weight inside the boiler. This is filled up with a smoke unit and a motor, so there's not much actual weight inside the boiler, and as a result, the engine's not super duper heavy. But I can understand why they made it a little bit thicker just to make sure that it doesn't break. But still, it just looks really bad. I feel like there's a better way of doing it. But anyways, because it is plastic though, I do plan to actually one day remove the running boards, sand them down, reattach all the detail parts, and hopefully that will make the engine look significantly better. So that's something that I do plan to do in the future. But it's just kind of baffling why BLI didn't do that. I feel like they could have done that better. Anyways, and the other detail thing that really bothers me personally, which is really small, is these headlights. So, you know, traditional headlights look like this. I'm always referencing this engine, by the way, because I feel like BLI did a really good job in terms of the detail and appearance of this engine. When I say I think it's a really good looking engine. Anyways, the E6 headlight for some reason has this basically this rear piece here, which looks really ugly to me. It stands out a lot, and it just looks bad to me. The reason they probably did it, I thought originally, was because they wanted to, you know, somehow fit a 3mm LED inside to save costs. But no, they actually added an SMD LED inside. It's a tiny little LED. If you actually take off the lens, you can kind of see that really small little dot in the middle. That is the LED. It is freaking tiny. So it makes it baffling why they couldn't fit a tiny LED like that inside this huge headlight by comparison, and you know, get rid of this rear part. For some reason, apparently I don't know why, but they decided they needed this rear part, even though the LED is so small, and it would have been easily would have been able to fit inside this headlight. But for some reason, they couldn't do it without adding this huge back piece here, which just looks really bad to me. Fortunately, it doesn't seem that hard to change. I could just remove that back piece and remount the LED into the headlight myself and get rid of this thing. So it's not something you can't fix, but it's just something that's kind of disappointing to see from the factory because it really stands out, especially with all the other fine detail that I mentioned on this model. So yeah, that's pretty much for detail. There's one more con, and this is a really big con actually, and that is just the design of the mechanism. So to kind of explain, okay, this engine has a smoke unit. As I said, that sacrifices a lot of pulling power because this engine is not super duper heavy. It is fairly heavy, especially for the size, but if there was a weight inside here instead of a smoke unit, this thing would be significantly heavier and it would pull a lot better. But because they added the smoke unit, they felt the need to add traction tires. Now, that's not a big problem if you have 10 driving wheels, which you know, the remaining 8 will pick up power and the last one will use traction tires. That's fine. But when your engine only has 2 sets of drivers, or 2 drivers, you're gonna have problems because the leading truck and trailing trucks are usually not used to pick up power, and I'll explain why later. But the main reason, and so basically you only have these 2 wheels picking up power and the tender picking up power. Now BLI chose to, instead of having 8 wheels pick up power in the tender, they only have wheels pick up from each side of the wheels, or of the trucks. So basically there's only 4 pickups on this tender and there's 8 wheels. So it relies actually quite a bit on the engine to pick up power. And with only one driver, you know, having pickups because the other one has traction tires, you're really cutting yourself a lot, you know, with that. So because of the lightweight, because of the smoke unit, you have one wheel that has to have traction tires. So in other words, in order to compensate for that, they actually added pickups to the leading truck. Yet again, they did not have all 4 wheels pick up power. Instead, they only had this wheel picks up from this side and this wheel picks up from this side. So these 2 are dead. So it's just not a good way to do it. So the leading truck now picks up power, and it's only half the wheels to pick up power. And the reason why you don't usually see pickups on leading, or you don't see engines rely on leading and trailing trucks on picking up power, is because they're not very reliable for picking up power. And the reason why is because usually these wheels don't have any, you know, weight attached to them. They just flop loosely, you know, there's no downward pressure on them. And that's good. The reason, because if you have, so because you basically, if you want these to be reliable pickups, you have to have downward pressure, you have to have weight or force put on them to push down onto the rails so they reliably can pick up power. In doing so, the BLI added a really stiff spring and basically have the front of the engine push down actively onto the leading trucks, which you might think sounds good, but all that means is that now this boiler weight, which is already not very heavy, is now even putting even less weight onto the main drivers because this part is effectively lifting the front of it up. So this boiler weight is now, more of this weight is wasted on pushing down the leading truck. So now there's even less weight to push down on the drivers, which means that it even needs it needs the traction tires even more now because there's even less weight put on the wheels. So you can kind of see how it's a cycle. Because of the smoke unit, because the boiler is light, they had to add traction tires to one of the drivers, which means that they needed more pickups on the leading truck, which, because leading trucks are not good at picking up power, they needed to put weight on the leading truck, which means even more boiler weight is sacrificed on putting weight on the leading truck, which means even less weight is put on the drivers. And it's just a cycle. It's a vicious cycle that is just best to be avoided. And they could have avoided it with many things. They could have added more pickups in the tender. They could have at least made all 4 of the wheels in the leading truck pick up power. They could have removed traction tires. They could have added more weight into the boiler and sacrificed the smoke unit. They could have simply said, this Atlantic probably should have should not have a smoke unit because it really needs the weight for the drivers. There's only 4 of them. But BLI was like, no, we're going to put smoke units inside this engine. We're going to put traction tires on this engine to compensate. We're going to make the leading truck pick up power. We're going to add a heavy spring. And that's where we come to this engine. So it's just, in terms of an engineering standpoint, it's just not, it could be designed better. But that's my gripes. BLI needs to satisfy those customers that really want smoke units. So I digress. Anyways, so that's like the biggest problem I have with this engine, is just that the pickups are poor. The pulling power is not great because of all these problems, and they try to compensate, and it sort of works, but at the end of the day, it's just not a good design. And the keep alive in the tender really helps with the lack of pulling power or lack of pickups. In fact, this engine will always kind of cut out and then go back in. Well, you can see it going back and forth between track pickup and using the keep alive. But yeah, it's just, it could be done better. And as someone who is really interested in the engineering of these models, it's just kind of disappointing. It could be done so much better, but they had to make those sacrifices, so I understand. Anyways, that's pretty much it for the negative things. I don't want to be too critical. I know I tend to be really negative in these videos, so that's it for the negative parts. As I said, not huge problems besides the last one. They're not huge problems. Overall, detail looks really good. Engine looks really good. And yeah, let's move on to the conclusion, where I kind of compare this with a few brass engines. So to conclude this sort of review, I was going to compare these with do a really short comparison between the BLI and the 2 affordable brass options that I mentioned. So in total, there's been 4 manufacturers of brass E6s that are comparable to the BLI E6. There's Gem Olympia, there's Alco Brass, there is Key, and I believe Railworks also made an E6. Now the Key and Railworks ones I don't have because they're like $500 to $800 per engine, and that's just not really comparable to the BLI engines, which again, right now the refurbished ones are $300. So the comparable ones that I mentioned in the previous video were these 2, being the Alco E6 and the Gem E6. Now, in the intro, as I said, it turns out there are more inaccuracies with these 2 that make it not very comparable to the BLI's details. In the previous videos I mentioned, basically I figured you can buy one of these for much cheaper, add some details, paint them, and add these yourself, and you'll end up significantly under the retail price of this engine. But now that this engine has dropped, these engines also have some more detail accuracies that I did not realize that they had, and I figured I'd share them before I end this video. So yeah, the Gem E6 has 2 major problems. For one, the boiler is mounted way too high. As you can see, well, first off, these drivers look really small, and that's because this boiler is too high, and you can kind of figure out how tall it is by the height of this running board versus the top of this driver. So you see that huge gap there? If you look at, for example, the Alco one, This is far more accurate. You can see the gap is much smaller, and this is correct. So the boiler is way too hot in this gem guy. The second thing they did wrong, major thing they did wrong, besides some, piping here and there, is the sand dome here. This is actually from their H10 sand dome. I think they reused it for some reason. In real life, the Alcos had a sand dome that was shaped like this. This is similar to the one used on the G5 and basically a smaller K4 sand dome. BLI also does it correct as here. But those are the main two issues with the gem that are basically really hard to repair. You have to find a new sand dome and you have to lower the boiler. And also some of the other details like this blowdown muffler, which never existed on E6s, or this weird pipe here. I actually spent a lot of time and I lowered the boiler on my other gem E6. As you can see, it's a much smaller gap. There's still a gap, but it looks a lot better. But this engine still needs a lot of work. It's a work in progress, but the goal is to lower it even more and change a lot of details to make it, basically up to standard, up to par. Anyways, the other option is the Alco E6, and this thing has more of a subtle issue, and that is the shape of the boiler and the firebox. So in real life, the E6 had a boiler that was slightly tapered, so it was bigger here and smaller in diameter here. The firebox is also bigger here, and they kind of, it's sloped. So yeah. On the Alco model though, it's a straight boiler basically. I see very little taper, if any. The boiler looks very just tubular, and the firebox as well looks very flat. There's no slope or taper. And that, as a result, makes this engine look kind of strange. It almost looks like an E5 to me, not an E6. So those are the two main things that the Alco had problems with. Also, the gearboxes are really crap, and they tend to not work like this guy here. But yeah. Anyways, that's pretty much it. Basically, both of these affordable options that I mentioned actually do have some really critical things that if you are extremely detail oriented, these will be very hard to repair or make correct. So with that all being said, if you're detail oriented and you're also on a budget, turns out BLI is the option for you. It is both easy, there's nothing major things you have to change, just some small details. It's more accurate and it's cheaper. Well, sort of. So, or far more affordable at least now. So again, my opinion on the BLI E6 is now in a much more positive light. Yes, there are things they could have done better, but also I think they did a really good job with this model. They knocked it out of the park. They added details that are usually only seen on really high-end brass engines. And so, as I said, this looks a lot better now. I can full-heartedly recommend this engine to anyone who's interested in buying an E6. So yeah, that's my thoughts on this engine though. That's pretty much sums up everything that I was gonna say. And yeah, I would like to hear your opinions down in the comments down below. Do you think BLI did a great job? Do you think there's anywhere that they could do better? I'd love to hear that. But that pretty much is it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.